I'm a sensory processing, sensory integration therapist. I'm an occupational therapist, and I do sensory integration as my specialty. And it is a form of therapy where you work with development and mainly with children, although you can do sensory work with adults as well. It's best to work with people the younger as young as possible, and you're looking at the way that they receive information through their senses and the way that they process it or not in their brains, and the output and the action that follows. Well, we have more than 5 senses. People know about the 5, which are our ears, our eyes, our nose, our taste through our mouth, and our skin. There's also 3 more that most people are not aware of, which is the inner ear, not to do with sound so much as to do with movement and balance and coordination. And then there's a proprioceptive sense, which is a big word for the receptors around the muscles and joints of our bodies. So it has again to do with the position of our joints and our bodies in relation to our head in movement. And well, those are the 2 extra main ones. There's a lot more tactile ones as well, which people aren't usually aware of through the skin. Infants are sensory motor learners till the age of 2, and that means that thinking only comes into play when they begin to use words. Words and thoughts are connected. So prior to an infant speaking, their whole way of processing themselves and others and their environment is through their senses. And so it's important for healthy children as well as children who have difficulties to assess the way that they process sensory information. What happens is that sometimes children are stronger with their eyes than their ears. Sometimes children are oversensitive and they receive too much information. They don't know how to block out information, and that's a problem. Other times they're under-responsive so that they're not responding and picking up the information. So the problem is the way that their lack of receiving information through their eyes and their ears and their nose and their mouth and their skin. Or they get too much of it and they can't block it out. They can't discriminate what to take in and what to leave at the door. It's about how the brain organizes information. And there are a hierarchy of sensory systems. So the first one, the main one, is our inner ear. And the name for that is the vestibule. Our ear has several parts. There's an outer ear, middle ear, and an inner ear. And in the inner ear, there's 2 parts, the vestibule and the cochlea. The vestibule has to do with balance and movement of the head. And then the second system is the proprioceptive system. I already named it. And that takes the information from the head to the muscles and the joints of the body. So the vestibule tells me that when I move my head, that it's my head moving and not the room. It has 3 planes of movement, up and down, side to side, and then the diagonal, which is this way. So it's yes, no, and maybe. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. And so from that head movement, it passes the information to the muscles of the joints of the body, so shoulders and elbows and wrists and fingers, and then the hips and the knees and the ankles and the toes. And that tells me when I move my leg, it's my leg that's moving, and it's this part of my leg that's moving, and it also gives the connections of the joints of the body. So the hip joint's connected to the knee joint's connected to the ankle joint. All that information has to get relayed to the brain. And then the brain gives meaning to it. So these are all passed by electrical currents and across synapses. It's all neurotransmitting. And so anywhere that there's a blockage in that process, then the information's not going to get there, or it's going to get there late, or it's going to get there confused, and you could have a traffic jam, so that you got information coming from your eyes and your ears, but and your joints of your fingers and your skin, but it's all clogged up at a certain place where the brain can't utilize it because it's not getting through to the right places in the brain. And so these are the kind of things that a sensory therapist assesses and works with. Where are the blockages? Is it too much information? Is it not enough information? And then how do we push through those blockages to help the brain to organize the information better so that the person can use it? It's always good to work with a parent or a carer, because they need to understand what they see. Because what usually goes wrong is a child's behavior. So they don't necessarily understand that it's a sensory issue or that it's a neurological issue. They see it as a behavioral issue. So then it's really good for the parent to be there when a therapist is working, because the therapist can then explain and help the parent to understand what they see. And a lot of behavior is based on sensory processing disorder. A lot of bad behavior is based on poor sensory processing. And so it really helps the child and the parent to understand what the cause of the behavior is. For instance, if a child is receiving too much information from their ears, and you'll see with children on the spectrum, meaning the autistic spectrum, a child who's autistic, on one end of the spectrum is autism, and the other end is sensory processing deficit. So a child who's autistic always has sensory processing difficulties. But a child who has sensory processing difficulties isn't necessarily autistic. So with autistic children, often they'll put their hands over their ears, or they'll scream, and they'll move their ears like this. They'll flap their hands over their ears, or they'll block their hands, or they'll go like that. Or when you turn on an appliance in the home, maybe a vacuum cleaner, or a blender in your kitchen, or a washing machine or a dryer, then the child will become very agitated. And it's because they're receiving the sound amplified through the skin and through their bones as well as their ears. And they can't block that sound out. So then they might start screaming. They might start running around the room. They might go hide somewhere. And a parent wouldn't necessarily understand why the child is doing that. And they wouldn't necessarily connect it to too much sound or too much vibration. And sound and vibration are just on a continuum of well, actually, light, sound, and vibration are all on a continuum of frequency of how strong it is. And so the therapist would then, I call it being a sensory detective, where you begin to kind of figure out, okay, well, what sensory system is having a difficulty with this, and is it too much, too little? And then once you figure that out, then you can know how to help a child. So if a child is oversensitive to sound, then really simple things you can do is put something on their skin or on their head, like a hat, or like earmuffs, or a headband, or just put more clothes on them, and then the sound will hit the fabric before it hits the skin, so it'll dampen that input. It's kind of a simple solution. Another thing you can do is put weight on the child. So you can, we have clothes, therapeutic clothes that are weighted vests, and that gives, because weight on skin and on joints calms a child down. And so when they're getting too much information, it causes them to be very anxious. And so the weight to the fabric will also block out, but it also calms them at the same time. It's a bit like a massage. When you put pressure on your body, that's calming. And so any kind of pressure will calm that child down, as well as try and block out the sound that's coming in. Parents are usually very keen to be part of the therapeutic process, because it's a whole language that they understand. I call it the sensory paradigm. And a paradigm is a conceptual way of seeing something. It's a way of seeing. And so when you begin to see through sensory processing, then it shifts a lot of guilt off the parent, and it certainly shifts a lot of shame and guilt off of the child, because they're not coping with their environment, they're not coping with their bodies, they're not coping with other people. And often the parent doesn't know why. And so it comes as a great relief to see that the therapist has an understanding that gives the parent understanding, because the parent is the number one advocate for a child with special needs. So the parent has to understand what's going on with their child. And then the other thing is that there's so much they can do at home and at school, if they're in school, and in the car, in the supermarket, in the activities of living that will make life easier for the child and hence for the parent, that usually the parent is very keen to be part of it. And the best way is to see the therapist at work with the child, to see the child change, to see what the therapist does to make the child okay. And it happens often straight away. So the child will be in the middle of a meltdown, for example, and a very simple intervention is to put something in their mouth and something in their hands. And
like what?
Well, if a child has difficulty moving from one place to another, and that's often because they're what we call lost in space. And so their inner ear is not telling them, that's the navigating system, the compass of the body, the compass of the ear is the compass of the body, is not telling the child that when I move my head, it's my head that's moving, not the room. And so they're really, and that when they, if a child has really difficulty with spatial relationship, they won't even be able to go across the center of an empty room. They would have to hug the wall. Why? Because by touching the wall, they know where they are. But if they just walked right through empty space, they wouldn't know how to negotiate the space, and they wouldn't know how to move their bodies through the space.
Sounds very serious.
That's how disabling it can be, and I've seen it many times with children. And then they just don't know how to. So if you're calling them across the room, they won't go. Or they'll have a meltdown and start crying. Or they'll run away. And the parent thinks they're just being difficult. No, they, all right, so when you put something in their hands, it helps them to focus their eyes on the object in their hand, and it gives them a point of contact to be able to move. So if they can look at the object, then they have something that goes with them. Because the problem is if you're in one place and it takes you about a half an hour to get used to where you are, and it's time to go. Well, that puts them in a panic. They don't want to go. Why? Because they don't know where they're going, and they don't know how to get there. And so the reason why you put something in their mouth is the jaw is the most calming joint in the body. And when you chew, it calms you down, because all of this stuff causes great anxiety in a child. And it's the anxiety that causes the bad behavior. And so if you can get them something to suck on, if they're old enough to not swallow gum, give them some gum to chew on, it'll calm them down. And then you can move them better because they're not so anxious. And then you give them something to play with in their hands, something they can squeeze, something nice to look at that preoccupies gives their attention and their focus. Then you can grab their hand or their elbow and escort them out the room. Swinging is the best therapeutic tool to use for the inner ear dysfunction, because what you want to do is figure out when they move in which direction and how much they can move before they become completely disoriented or overwhelmed. The technical term is called gravitational insecurity, which is a big name for not even feeling safe to have their feet off the ground. Because as soon as their feet are off the ground, they are completely disoriented. And it's very frightening. It's almost like feeling like you're going to fall off a cliff or fall into a deep, dark tunnel. You really don't know where you are. The closest people might be able to understand is if they have vertigo or motion sickness. That's all part of the inner ear and the vestibule. And so when you put a child on a swing, then you can work with that in very precise detail. It's to do with your balance, and then that has to do with postural reflexes. A lot of these kids, when their shift is off, when they're off balance, like they're on a moving surface, like a swing, or a board that moves, tilt board, when they're moving this way, they don't know that their head should go that way to center themselves. So they just fall. The head doesn't correct it because the head isn't detecting the movement. The ear isn't detecting the movement, so the head doesn't go like that. But if I were to shift you off balance, you'd go like that. If I was going to push you over that way, someone's going to push me, I'd go like that. And my whole body would arch that way to come back to center. A child with difficult ear perceptions or reception of that sensation just falls over.
So can you
so
improve that?
Oh, absolutely. What you're doing is you're building new neurological pathways, and you're breaking through the resistances, or you're heightening the sensory input so they can feel it. So if they can't feel it, the problem is under response, then you heighten the sensation so they begin to develop the relay system to feel it. And if it's too much, then you dampen it so that they're not overwhelmed. A child who has gravitational insecurity, you're not going to get them on a swing straight away.
Why not?
Because they won't let you lift their feet off the ground and be on it without someone holding them. And
So what do you do?
well, you have to build it up in stages, and a child's work is play, so everything has to be done as play and as fun, and you're always having to capture their attention, because the other problem is that the eyes are hardwired to the ears, and so a lot of these kids who have trouble with their balance and equilibrium, their focus is terrible because their eyes aren't working in coordination with their ears, because balance has a lot to do with your eyes. When someone spins around like a ballerina, they focus their eye, and then they spin, and then they focus their eye, and they spin, and they focus their eye. So the eye focus is really important to balance. Well, these kids' eyes are like, the muscles of their eyes are low tone, so they don't have any focus. Your first job is just to get them to look at you, or to look at the thing you want them to pay attention to. And that can take weeks. But again, the parent needs to understand, okay, our first problem here is focus and motivation, which are very connected. And so you got to learn to be very playful. You got to learn to use a lot of different sensory input at the same time. So when you want to get them to move, add sound, because singing, sound and movement are like a marriage, and one cues in the other. So if they're not getting it through the movement, get it through the sound. If they're not getting it through the sound or the movement, get it through the touch, the sound, and the movement. So you got the hands-on thing. And that becomes the skill of the therapist, really.